So today on our podcast, we continue our story of Disney legend Mary Blair, who not only helped shape the look of many Disney animated features, but also designed key attractions and installations for both Disneyland and later Walt Disney World. We are now up to part 9. And in earlier episodes, we looked at her childhood, her days in art school, and her time at multiple animation studios in Los Angeles before joining her husband, Lee, at Disney's. When we last left off, Mary and a handful of Disney artists, including her husband, had returned from their trip to Latin America with material to make Saludos Amigos, a Disney feature mostly focused on the culture of Brazil and Argentina. With other artists, she then watched the war descend down around California and also saw servicemen move into the studio. At the end of the summer of 1942, Lee joined the Navy, leaving Mary to explore life in Los Angeles and at the Disney studio, mostly on her own. And this is where we pick it up today. In November 1942, Mary Blair's life was beginning to change again. Her husband, Lee, was in the Navy, presently moving through a military training program at the University of Arizona. For the first time since her days at Chenard, Mary was living alone, though now in a house with a large studio that supported her work as an artist. For the previous 8 years, Mary's home life had been partially arranged around her and Lee's identity as professional watercolorists who created works to be sold at galleries. In this, partially through Lee, Mary had found a social life in the gallery world, also engaging conversations as to the value and nature of contemporary art. But without Lee, Mary's social life was more focused around the Disney studio. Many of the people she invited over worked for Disney, and as such, the conversations at her house partially shifted to the value and nature of art created for animated films. During these weeks, Mary saw her role at the studio shift as Walt took a deeper interest in her art. Walt sensed the vitality and color arrangements of her paintings might bring a new type of visual depth to the screen. But after Bambi, the studio didn't have any large projects in development. Disney's creditor, the Bank of America, had allowed them to finish Bambi, which had been started long before the war. But now the Bank of America deemed traditional features too risky of an investment, especially as large parts of the European market remained closed to Hollywood films. Though the Disney studio had been developing a number of features, including Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, and Peter Pan, they were forced to set these projects aside and instead focus on training films, propaganda films, films that packaged short-subject cartoons into feature-length projects, and films whose profit was guaranteed by the CIAA, which Walt now saw as the primary place to use Mary's talents. Mary's next assignment was to develop material for a second Good Neighbor feature, this time with a focus on Mexico. Much as Walt had found value in placing artists in Brazil and Argentina to visually and musically develop story ideas initiated at the studio, he now believed something similar might be accomplished in Mexico, though with a shorter and less expensive trip. This required selecting a new group of artists and employees. The original group who had ventured to Brazil and Argentina included 4 concept artists: Lee Blair, Mary Blair, Jim Bodero, and Herb Ryman, all of whom produced excellent work. All of them, except for Lee, were still employed by Disney, but only one was invited on the second Disney outing to Latin America, Mary Blair, which further solidified her rising position at the studio. Also included were artist Ken Anderson, animator Fred Moore, and animator Eric Larson. Once more, Mary was the only female artist on the trip. The political backstory for the 1942 Disney trip to Mexico was similar to that of the 1941 trip to Brazil and Argentina. namely to further political unity between Mexico and the United States. In 1941 and for the first half of 1942, Mexico had taken a position of neutrality concerning the war, leaning toward pacifism. Officially, Mexico condemned Nazi aggression in Europe and broke off relations with Japan after Pearl Harbor, but it wasn't until May 1942, after Nazi submarines sank 2 Mexican oil tankers, that the country formally sided with the Allies. Mexico's role would not be to send combat troops to Europe, as had the United States and Canada, but to provide raw materials to the United States and other allied countries to support the war effort. Despite Mexico's new stance, the U.S. government eyed a handful of Mexican officials, including Minister of the Interior Miguel Alemán, as dangerously pro-German, as Americans didn't yet know how to read Mexicans' recent political shift. In September, Minister of the Interior Miguel Alemán visited Hollywood, largely to strengthen cultural and economic ties, which had been damaged during Mexico's period of neutrality. This trip was to ensure mutual defense against the Japanese, who could easily attack both Mexico and America by crossing the Pacific. Alemán visited multiple studios, including Disney, where artists were already exploring material related to Mexico. The purpose of this material was not only to present culture through animation, but also to strengthen the political ties between America and its neighbors to the south. As with the first Goodwill trip, this one too would be underwritten by the CIAA, whereas the first trip, from the perspective of the Disney artists, seemed to take place far from the immediate concerns of the war. This one would lift them out of one war-centered country and place them into another that nervously monitored the Pacific for enemy ships, aircraft, and submarines. The 2-week trip began on the evening of Monday, December 7th, with the first group of Disney artists flying to Mexico City. Mary was in the second group, which included Walt and Lillian, who traveled a day later on December 8th. The overall goal was to further develop existing story ideas with dance, music, geographic elements, and cultural specifics. The studio had a working title for the film, Surprise Package, but that would be later changed to The Three Caballeros. In and around Mexico City, the group observed the Indian pole dance and the Dance of the Old Men, both performed at Rancho Blanco. They visited Rancho Artistas, a center arranged for local artists. They saw bullfights and attended a local sporting event. They stopped by the American Embassy. They developed a new character, one who would represent the culture of Mexico in the same way that Jose Carioca represented Brazil. For this character, Disney animators would eventually settle on a swaggering little rooster, whose image and personality evolved over time and was much later named Panchito Pistoles. For the most part, the artists all enjoyed being away from home, as they went to galleries and arts communities, but in terms of Mary's artistic development, the most important event was the Las Posadas celebration. Las Posadas was a Christmas tradition dating back in Mexico to the late 1500s, a celebration in which children reenacted events from a New Testament gospel. 2 children dressed as Mary and Joseph acted out their return to Bethlehem while Mary was pregnant with Jesus. The children would knock at one door and ask for shelter, only to be told, "No posada," that there wasn't any room. The reenactment typically ended, once the religious play was over, with a piñata that the children broke into a cascade of candy and other sweets. Most of the Disney group saw 2 Las Posadas performances, though Mary Blair was not at the first. She was there for the second. The event was perfect for her artistic style. Colorful costumes, a holiday focused on joy, and the lead roles played by young children. With other artists, Mary followed the children performers as they moved from door to door and asked for shelter. With them was also a small choir and a musical director who distributed printed lyrics so the crowd could join in with song. The event ended with a piñata and dinner, but the center of the celebration, at least for Mary, was the children. With this, Mary's artistic vision evolved yet again. Once more, she combined bold colors with highly stylized images of children, much as she had done the previous year in Peru. These images presented both the personality of the children and the culture in which they lived. Now in Mexico, Mary expanded her skills to include narrative. Instead of individual still lives focused on a single figure, she created a sequence of paintings to tell a short, linear story, much like panels in a comic strip, images in a slideshow, or storyboard drawings arranged on a Leica reel. Unlike Lee, who the previous year had mostly created watercolors of South America in his familiar style, Mary repeatedly adapted her approach to art to fit the needs of film production. Film didn't simply rely on static characters and backgrounds, it presented moving characters and changing backgrounds. In this, she rethought how watercolors produced during field research might be more useful to the production of film. She arranged her paintings into a sequence that captured the developments of the Posadas play. Overall, the 2 weeks in Mexico were viewed as a success, with artists producing hundreds and hundreds of drawings and paintings. They collected musical recordings and information about Mexican dance. From the perspective of global politics, the trip was also viewed as a success. Walt and his artists were cheered by thousands of fans as they moved through Mexico, making them ideal American ambassadors. Mexicans in every walk of life, Walt said, are 100% behind the United States and the Allies in the war. The trip ended just a few days before Christmas, with most returning to Burbank. Mary, however, did not fly home with the others. Instead, she took a flight to Tucson to spend time with Lee at the University of Arizona. Likely without realizing it, Mary was establishing a pattern that would define her life for the next 3 years. She would spend time with Lee where he was stationed and then return to Los Angeles, where she arranged her days and her art as she liked, with very little outside interference except for encouragement and the occasional suggestion from Walt. But in 1942, she spent the Christmas holidays with Lee, and then, after New Year's, she returned home. At this point, even though she had only worked at Disney's for a few years, she was becoming an artist central to the studio. In previous years, when Disney needed 2 or 3 people to give public presentations about animation, Walt typically chose longtime animators. Animators drew the characters which were the most recognizable elements in Disney animation. Occasionally, Walt sent out Herb Ryman, who was an armchair expert on world art when the studio needed someone to speak about Disney's connection with South America. But now Walt moved Mary into the mix of studio spokespeople, including those who spoke with the press. In one interview, Mary told a reporter, "It was wonderful to be in Mexico, to forget about the war for 2 weeks and not think of tire or gas rationing." Then she discussed Disney's artistic goals south of the border. For the previous decade, the primary jobs of the Disney concept artist had been to create images that would shape the visual style and color range for a feature. It was exploratory work accomplished by some of the most gifted individuals employed by Walt, but their concept paintings rarely showed up on screen and were rarely seen by the public. In the weeks after the Mexico trip, Mary worked on concepts for a Las Posadas sequence, something that would show children moving through a village, each carrying a candle. After viewing them, Walt believed that Mary's work might be presented directly on screen as a series of linked paintings. The sequence would be composed entirely of her watercolors, with small touches of effects animation. Mary Blair's color keys were so beautiful. Animator Frank Thomas explained that Walt thought they required an extreme minimum of animation, the candle flickering or the eyes batting, something like that. With this, he could finally capture Mary Blair's design color on the screen. In this, Walt offered Mary a way to showcase her work directly inside of the feature. But beyond this, Walt may have been focused on practical ways to use Mary's stylized children, which involved a design approach at odds with spherical figures typically used by the studio. Mary was becoming less concerned with depth, perspective, and dimension in her watercolors. Her figures existed on a plane, with the world flattened out behind them. Walt found them engaging, but likely understood that flat images would be difficult to translate into traditional animation, which relied on layered depth to fill realistic spaces. The easiest way to put Mary's vision on the screen was through a series of roughly a dozen still images that Mary herself produced. Effects animators could add moving accents, stars would shimmer and candle flames flicker, but for the most part, the story of Las Posadas would be told through a set of paintings that featured the highly stylized images of the Mary Blair children moving through an equally flat presentation of a small Mexican village. But the Posadas sequence wasn't the only place where Mary's art directly shaped the on-screen presentation of the Three Caballeros. Her paintings were also used as background images for the Bahia section, in which Donald Duck and Jose Carioca take a whimsical train through a jungle of neon palms, peppermint ferns, and lakes filled with gas blue water. Les Clark would provide the animation, but Mary herself painted the world that Donald and Jose explored, while riding on a comical train with one square wheel affixed to its caboose. I'll tell you a place where Mary Blair worked, and worked awfully well, animator Ollie Johnston said, was the little train to Bahia. She'd done this keen drawing on black paper of all of the little palm trees. They were very decorative, and it was easy to keep the train going around through her design. Though Mary often shied away from discussing her work at length, often to avoid an appearance of pride, when asked, she would talk about this sequence. "Yes, I actually did paint the backgrounds for the little train sequence," she said. "Walt said that I knew about colors he had never heard of before." She even talked about the sequence 2 decades later with her niece, Maggie Richardson, who came to see the unique train as a thematic representation of Mary herself. "She made a hot pink train with one square wheel," Richardson said. "That was pretty much a symbol of Mary in my book. It was like there were the guys at the studio, and they were probably the round wheels. And Mary was the one square wheel." The square wheel was the one element that didn't quite fit the function of the train, but as Richardson observed, it was also the part of the train that viewers found most memorable. While production continued on the film that would become The Three Caballeros, Walt had another job for Mary Blair. By this point, she had assumed a unique role among the studio's concept artists. Her work not only shaped the visual style for a sequence, at times it appeared on screen as well. Walt wanted to send her to Cuba to work on a proposed third Good Neighbor picture, this one more focused on Cuba and the Caribbean. In this, she would be the first Disney artist to define the visual grammar of yet another feature. Styling sketches at Disney's, director Wilfred Jackson explained, were inspirational designs or paintings made by an artist such as Mary Blair, assigned by Walt to style the picture. These were usually made in the early stages of production while the story was being developed and before any animation had started. For Saludos Amigos and the Three Caballeros, the studio had assigned multiple concept artists to visually interpret the mood and style of Central and South America as well as Mexico. But now Walt looked more to Mary than to other artists. These sketches helped Walt decide how he wanted the picture to look when it was all done, continued Jackson. They were used to show us who made the cartoon elements, what Walt wanted us to make them look like. So when Mary styled one of Walt's cartoons, this is the way we made use of her styling sketches. Only on this trip, Mary wouldn't be joined by other concept artists and animators. She would be joined only by story artist Bill Cottrell and Jack Cutting, who focused on music that might be used in the film. Signaling Walt's growing trust in Mary's abilities, she would be the lone artist on the initial trip to this island country. In a letter to Francis Alstock, who worked with the Motion Picture Society for the Americas, Walt explained, "I've decided to send Mary Blair to Cuba. She was one of the group who made the Goodwill tours of South America and Mexico. I believe it best for her to be in Cuba by March 28th, inasmuch as Jack Cutting and Bill Cottrell will be there at that time and can aid in her gathering material." In a separate letter to Robert H. McBride, Secretary of the U.S. Embassy in Havana, Walt explained Mary's role in Cuba. "We will have some advanced knowledge of the country, which will shape the Caribbean picture and also guide later research trips to the country." The Cuban and Caribbean package feature at that time had a working title of Carnival, and later Cuban Carnival, in which both Donald and Jose Carioca visited Havana and other scenic locales in the region. Mary left California on March 19th, but as with the Mexico trip, this one too served two purposes. As she was traveling across country, she took time to first visit Lee, who was then stationed at the Anacostia Naval Base in Washington, D.C. There he worked as a producer to create training films for the Navy. In this, Lee felt he was becoming, in small ways, a person like Walt Disney, who oversaw and managed film production rather than producing art himself. In his mind, Lee made small connections between his current role and that occupied by Walt. Though Walt produced a range of film projects, both men now created short films to train military recruits who needed to acquire new skills. Mary spent roughly a week with Lee before traveling to Miami, where she caught a plane to Havana. As her husband, Lee recalled, Mary went to Cuba and was down there and researched a lot of Afro-Cuban music. But as Mary herself explained, her research goals were much larger. She used Havana as a home base, then made excursions into the surrounding areas to study the music, folklore, festivals, dances, and backgrounds of the Cubans. She observed lines of people waiting to get milk, butter, and bread. She noticed that locals loved music. When one person rhythmically tapped sticks together, others would join in to create a song or to dance. She took notes on Cuban food and history. She painted natural landscapes, also images of the city. She learned some of the slang, including the phrase "bang gang," pronounced like two drum beats, which meant everything was okay. She went to cigar factories and sugar plants. She discovered that due to the war, many nightclubs were now closed, with their performers living abroad. With the help of the State Department, she visited Santiago, a city far from tourist areas. For her, the high point of the journey was a night at a music hall, where local performers played music in the tumba francesca tradition based on African drum rhythms. On this night, she and others danced until the early hours of the morning. In an April 8th letter to Walt, Mary wrote, "In many respects, Cuba is similar to Brazil and offers equally interesting picture possibilities with its music, landscape, customs, and its people." She suggested that the albatross might be an animal that Disney could use as an animated character in the film. She also pointed out that some nightclubs were closed because, as she understood it, many Cuban musicians were presently living in New York. Though Mary was scheduled to return directly to California, she, along with Jack Cutting and Bill Cottrell, scheduled a side trip to New York to see Cuban singers perform there, typically in nightclubs. These were the singers who had left Cuba during the war. With this, Mary believed that Disney would be able to create a successful film focused on Cuba, with some sections exploring other Caribbean locales, much of it underscored by performers she found in Manhattan. In the fall, another group of artists would head to Cuba, where they would use Mary's notes and images as a starting point to further develop stories and musical sequences for the film. Though The Three Caballeros would be released to theaters on February 3, 1945, just 3 months before the war ended in Europe, the Carnival film focused on Cuba would never be finished, in large part because, with the war over, its political message was no longer needed and could no longer be funded by the CIA. A few sequences planned for the film would eventually show up in other musical efforts created by Disney in the second half of the 1940s. Blame It on the Samba, perhaps the most important example originally considered for a Cuban carnival, would be revised and presented in the 1948 package feature Melody Time. Mary's trip to Cuba in the spring of 1943 further solidified her unique position at the studio. For the previous 2 decades, the Disney studio had functioned as a commercial arts colony, in which employees worked in teams or at least pairs to create collaborative productions. Animators typically worked as a group with a lead, a couple of assistants, and a few in-betweeners. Story artists worked either in teams or in pairs, typically with one person focused on dialogue, the other on sketches. Even songwriters worked in pairs, with one composing the melody, the other writing the lyrics. But in this atmosphere of collaboration, Mary was demonstrating that she had the ability to work independently, also far from the studio, as a type of early researcher and visual planner for large projects that interested Walt. As the year moved forward, it was this unique role that defined her importance to the studio. Though her role was never defined in writing, as she now saw it, her position involved working with the writers and helping to create ideas of the picture graphically right from the formation of the film, right from its basic beginning. No one else at Disney then held or ever had held a similar role, in which their art was the primary forerunner for multiple future features. In terms of her daily life, when in Burbank, she kept a formal 8-to-5 schedule, but she found herself thinking about her work even while at home. A creative person is not necessarily tied down here, she explained. Your ideas may come to you in the middle of the night. In this, she found herself working on studio projects in the large home workspace that overlooked the hill. No one works for me or is under me, she said. She simply worked with direction from producers, directors, and often from Walt himself. She understood her new role as what she called an idea-creating position. Still with Lee gone, she found not only excitement in her new role, but also a type of loneliness. The 3-story house where she lived had initially been purchased with the idea that she and Lee would have children there. But without Lee, she found her hilltop retreat somewhat empty. She often invited over Retta Scott, who had been a lead animator on Bambi. Mary was my best friend, Retta explained. She also invited over studio nurse Hazel George. As before, Mary volunteered for group activities and even organized some of them. That fall, she oversaw a Disney mural for the maternity ward at St. Joseph's Hospital, then being built across the street from the studio. Her mural featured a cartoon stork wearing a top hat and holding a stopwatch, as he signaled for 5 other storks, each holding a baby wrapped in a presentation blanket, that it was time to leave the clouds and deliver their precious cargo to waiting families below. The cartoon storks were dressed in shirts and jackets, and the mural itself was touched with the traditional tones of blues and pinks. She continued to exhibit her work in town, though now the work she presented was tied to her role at the studio. In this, she was again mixing her life in animation and her life as an individual artist related to local museums and galleries. She was invited to present watercolors that she had created in Latin America at the Los Angeles County Museum for a month-long one-woman show. Her paintings, one reviewer noted, are gay and colorful and have that uncanny third dimension Disney artists learned to capture. Brightly clad villagers of Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico, the fishermen of Lake Titicaca, and other charming things off the beaten track south of the border. In this, Walt was again placing her as one of the few artists who publicly represented his studio for the public and the press. At the end of October, she turned 32. By this point, her life was significantly different from that girl who had grown up in Morgan Hill, hoping someday to teach art at a public school. Retta Scott arranged a party for her at the big hilltop house. Many of those who came had journeyed with Mary either on the South American trip or on shorter excursions to Mexico and Cuba. Norm Ferguson, Jack Cutting, Herb Ryman, and Freddie Moore, as well as other studio artists and those who lived nearby. Mary would say that the highlight of the day was a call from her husband during a period when operator-assisted cross-country calls were difficult to place. Mary was already planning to take a train to Washington, D.C. to be with him for the Christmas holidays, but on this day they simply talked for a while. Then Mary returned to her guests. This was her life now. Her art was becoming focused on film production at a studio that gave her tremendous freedom and responsibility, and her husband was stationed thousands of miles away, where he produced training films for the Navy. She didn't much care for the separation, but also the arrangement gave her the space to grow as an artist, to throw herself fully into the work of the studio, whereas if Lee had been home, he would have nudged her toward personal watercolors that she could exhibit under only her name, unrelated to the studio. But in this space, during a time when Americans still watched the sky for enemy aircraft, Mary Blair was increasingly becoming herself, a person who could fuse her art with Walt's dreams to create uniquely inspired paintings. I'll be back next week with a new episode, and at least right now, the plan is to continue our story of Disney legend Mary Blair. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.